So Walls makes a striking claim when he says, crossing cultural boundaries has been the lifeblood of historic Christianity. Now, I think Christians are often too proud. They say, well, it's our culture that has been Christian for so long. So sometimes we might think, well, it is, 20th century churches that have really, emphasized the importance of crossing cultural barriers. We might say, well, it was in the last, 200 years that American Christians really emphasized translating the Bible into different languages and supported things like Wycliffe Bible translators. But Walls argues is that crossing cultural boundaries has always occurred. And then he even says, this was the means by which the church expanded then and now. That is very striking. That emphasizes the importance, too, of bringing the gospel across cultural barriers, because the sending church might very well wither away and die, as has happened to many, many churches throughout history. In the language of Revelation chapter 2, Jesus Christ moves the lampstand out of its place. That is a picture of how he ceases to gather his elect in a specific location when they have lost their first love and given themselves over to apostasy. And then Christ, what he does is he goes elsewhere and gathers his church elsewhere at a different locale. So the transmission of the Christian faith across cultural boundaries that were on the periphery from the Christian heartland was crucial to the survival of Christianity. And so Walls here is making some striking claims. He says, indeed, with hindsight, he says, we can see that on several occasions this transmission took place only just in time, that without it, the Christian faith must surely have withered away. And Walls doesn't just see this in the past, he finds the same serial process today. He says, but the serial process of recession and advance, of withering heartland and emergence within a new cultural setting can be seen in much more recent times. I would not wish to go to the stake for the figures given in the World Christian Encyclopedia, but I'm sure that the direction that they indicate, the situation that can be extrapolated from them, is broadly correct. On this basis, one can reckon that in the year 1800, well over 90% of the world's professing Christians lived in Europe or North America. Today, something like 60% of them live in Africa, Asia, Latin America, or the Pacific, and that proportion keeps rising year by year. Still more strikingly, there were as recently as 1900 perhaps 10 million professing Christians on the African continent. Today, an educated guess, he says, puts around more like 300 million, and that figure is rising too. So it is a good thing, isn't it, that Europeans passed on the Christian faith to the global south, since Christianity in Europe has experienced an unprecedented recession. There's been a great falling away from the truth, a lack of love of the truth in Europe. And Walls says, in the last 100 years, we have seen the most considerable recession from the Christian faith to occur since the early expansion of Islam. And the area most affected has been Europe. A rather longer period has seen the most substantial accession to the Christian faith for at least a millennium. And that accession has taken place in the southern continents, especially in Africa, Latin America, and the Pacific. Also, always predicted by gloomy prophets, the pace of Christian recession in the West has probably been faster than even the gloomiest expected. So notice what he's saying here. He's saying, okay, we have seen in our last century, in the 20th century, what he has argued about. We have seen the recession of Christianity in Europe and in the West. And at the same time, what have we seen? Tremendous growth in the two-thirds world countries in the global south. and how many resources that England had or that North America had went into missions in the two-thirds world? What percentage do you think of all the money spent by Christians in the 19th and the 20th century, what percentage of all of that, of the donations of the saints, went to support world missions? And of course, the answer is a very, very, very small percentage compared to the amount of ministers that were laboring in the United States, in Canada, and in Great Britain. A very, very small percentage of them were sent overseas in world missions. So in other words, outreach that was on the periphery, that involved only a small, tiny percentage of the church's investment in the kingdom, was used by God to raise up a global church while in the heartland, what had been the heartland of England and Germany, the church is in many ways bankrupt. And we find the rise of new homelands. Walls is telling us that this is the sort of thing that is going to continue. So Walls has a lot to say about the history of expansion in the history of Christianity. He says there is a significant feature of each of these demographic and cultural shifts of the Christian center of gravity. In each case, a threatened eclipse of Christianity was averted by its cross-cultural diffusion. Notice what he's saying there. He's saying it was the spread and diffusion of Christianity to new areas that really saved the Christian church. So just think of even New England. If religion in the United States and Christianity in the United States only continued to exist in New England where it once was so strong, we would be in a rough situation in the United States because church attendance is seriously down throughout New England, whereas in other parts of the country, in the Midwest or in the South, you have things that can even be termed a Bible Belt. So crossing cultural boundaries has been the lifeblood of historic Christianity. And Walls says that it is also noteworthy that most of the energy for the frontier crossing has come from the periphery rather than from the center. So there's been a shift, he says, in the Christian heartlands. And that's nothing new. Think back to the first centuries. First, the heartland of Christianity was Israel, the land of Canaan. And then there was a shift, I think, in a number of different directions. One was to Egypt, and then there was also a shift towards Asia Minor. And then with the growth of the church in Greece, that became a heartland. And as time went on, Italy became a heartland of Christianity. North Africa, where Augustine lived in the 4th and early 5th century, was a heartland of Christianity. But those heartlands would in time weaken or even almost die out, and God would begin to gather his church elsewhere. And so Wall states that today Christians are no longer necessarily representative Westerners, and Westerners are not necessarily representative Christians. That makes the period of double identity the more interesting. So what we need to see is that nothing new is happening here. And the churches in America and in Britain need to be humble and recognize that what is happening today on a global scale is something that has happened many, many times before, where daughter churches that have been planted grow and mature and become a heartland, whereas the mother churches back home can weaken and even almost disappear. So when we look at the Christian church on other continents, we may not have a paternal perspective towards them, a paternal, that is a fatherly, domineering attitude towards them. We need to look at them as churches that already now have histories. They might have histories of 100 or 200 years. They need to be given the freedom to develop it. Now, that doesn't mean that Christian churches in the West can't help other churches mature biblically and theologically. But at the same time, we need to recognize that what is happening has happened many times before. And just like, for example, the Reformed churches in the Netherlands matured, we could say, rather quickly after the Protestant Reformation. So that when we think of, for example, the Dutch Reformed churches at the Synod of Dort and say, wow, the churches at the Synod of Dort were quite mature by that time, which was only 100 years after the Protestant Reformation, we should say, well, yes, Christian churches in 100 years can mature and develop, have their own history. Now, no Western church has ever had to beat away to survival, Walls teaches, like the church in China has. Now, it's true that in the Western church, the Dutch Reformed, for example, did have to fight for their existence against the Spanish who had ruled the Netherlands and who brutally persecuted and murdered so many Reformed Christians. But when you look what is happening in China and the challenges that they have faced in the last century, it's like you're looking back to the early church and what the early church faced in the first centuries. And when we talk about challenges that churches experience, we might have to say is that the early church never even faced what is going on in the African churches, where they deal with constant political problems, violence, war, that perhaps didn't even happen in the early centuries of the Christian church with the Peace of Rome. Now, they face hunger, though, like the early church and many poor Christians did. They do face oppression like happened in the Roman Empire. But there's plagues, all kinds of problems and challenges that maybe only the early church can, in some sense, relate to. But the question is, what does this all mean? What does this mean for a church like a church in Kenya? You know, what is the situation that early Christians faced, and how does that compare to what is being faced by the church in Kenya in its second century? So he says that the new thing that's happening in world Christianity is that, 200, 300, 400 years ago, areas that were the heartland of Christianity had privileged status. Often the churches in Europe were state churches. In England, there was the Church of England. The Scots had the Scottish Presbyterian Church. The Dutch Reformed Church was the state church in the Netherlands. The Lutheran churches were the state churches in Germany. But something new is happening. Something new is happening today, like happened in the early church, where new heartlands of Christianity do not have such a privileged status. What kind of privileged status does the church in China possess today? And so he identifies new churches who are not part of what we call Christendom, where there's a state connection to the church, as the new heartlands. See, that's the new reality. He says the new Christian heartlands in Africa and Asia, and it is now becoming curiously evident even in Latin America, are neither extensions nor replicas of Christendom, at least Christendom even in a Protestant context. Of course, the churches in Latin America arise out of a Roman Catholic context. But he says Christendom is dead. Notice what he's saying. He says Christendom is dead. This idea that somehow churches have a privileged status because the government supports them, he says that's dead. And yet he says Christianity is alive and well without it. Now, sometimes we can hear all the troubles in the church in China, and we better pray for the church in China. But at the same time, we can say Christ is upholding his church in China, even though she is not protected by the government. And so there is a demographic change in the church. But once again, this is nothing new. This is something that has happened in the history of Christianity. This is how Christ has preserved his church. That's Wall's keen insight here. Christ has preserved his church in the way of moving the golden lampstand from heartlands of Christianity to other places. And so there are these demographic transfers of Christianity to new places. In 1893, for example, Korean Christianity barely existed. Latin America was a place where evangelical Protestant missionaries could scarcely go. And Africa was a place that was so discouraging because so many missionaries from the United States and Europe died so shortly after arriving on the continent. And yet something has happened. Now there has been a growth of Christianity on the peripheries, so that Christianity now is predominantly, Wall says, a non-Western religion. He says Africa now is an outstanding Christian heartland. Latin America is becoming a Christian heartland. And there are important communities in Asia, whether it's Korea or Singapore with a smaller group, or China with a large number of confessing Christians. So how is Christ going to preserve and gather his church until the end of times? Well, by continuing to do the same thing. So there's this really curious feature of how God has worked in human history. How he basically uses work that's done on the peripheries to bring the gospel across cultural boundaries. Little energy is expended from the very heartland, it seems. And the result is that a mother church at home might fall into complacency and heresy. But God now begins a new dynamic and gathers his church in a new area. So the process by which Christ gathers his church is not just slow and gradual and progressive. Instead, it is serial. Now, long ago, Kenneth Scott Latourette, who is a church historian, pointed out that the growth of Christianity had not been steady progress. It had not been one of unresisted triumph, but instead he made the point that it occurred in a different way. People point out that Islam might make a better claim than Christianity for progressive expansion, for steady numerical increase and then geographical growth. Now, there are exceptions to that. There were areas that became Islamic and are no longer Islamic. But as a rule, that does seem to be the case more with Islam. But in contrast with Christianity, you find that there are places that are the homeland. And then, as time goes on, churches in England and in France and in Germany are turned into furniture stores, garages, nightclubs. Walls says the Christian story is serial. Its center moves from place to place. No one church or place or culture owns it. See, that's the danger. The Christians in one context say, our culture, our tradition, is going to be the place where Christianity always has a homeland. No, Walls says, at different times, different peoples and places have become its heartlands, its chief representatives. Then the baton passes on to others. This is also a reminder of the importance of engaging in cross-cultural missions. I think that's one of the massive implications of this. If what has happened is that Christ has used the transmission of the gospel across cultural boundaries in order to gather his church in a new area, while he moves the golden lampstand out of its place in old homelands, then for the glory of Christ and for the continuing existence of the Christian church, we need to be supportive of cross-cultural missions. Walls says, Christian progress is never final, never a set of gains to be plotted on the map. The rhetoric of some of our hymns and many of our sermons about the triumphant host streaming out to conquer the world is more Islamic than Christian. Wow, that is quite a critique, isn't it? Now, as Walls takes a look at this reality of former homelands dying out, and then suddenly on the periphery, a Christian church growing and becoming a new heartland, he says there's a certain fragility to the Christian faith. He says you don't find that in Hinduism, and you don't find that in Islam, he says. He says, Christian history reveals the faith often withering in its heartlands, in its centers of seeming strength and importance, to establish itself on or beyond its margins. It has vulnerability, a certain fragility at its heart. The vulnerability of the cross, the fragility of the earthen vessel. In other words, cross-cultural diffusion has been necessary to Christianity. It has been its life's blood, and without it, the faith could not have survived. It does not, like so many of the religions of India, belong to a particular soil. Nor does it, like Islam, produce a distinctive and immediately recognizable form of civilization. This reminds me what Herman Bavinck says about the Catholicity of Christianity. But what Walls is saying is that there are some religions that seem to just get embedded in one specific culture. But there's a certain fragility to Christianity. And I think that what is fragile about Christianity is that we have a jealous God. Our God is a jealous God. And he desires that his people would love him with the first love. And when his covenant people begin to turn away from the love of the truth and begin to turn away from their first love, God in his jealousy begins to gather his people elsewhere, where new converts do have a love of the truth and do have the first love for God and for Christ and for each other. And so God gathers his church in a remarkable way. And God has used the gospel being brought across cultural barriers to sustain and build his church throughout history. So Walls sees the expansion of Christianity as serial in nature. That is his first key insight. Next time, we will look at his second key insight, which is that conversion is a social reality, he says.